Before we start, I think let's the acknowledgement of his country. We would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Nugunawal, and Bundungara, and Pripi, people of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which CSU, Charles Sturt University's campuses are located, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present. Welcome again to this first research colloquium. And in this research colloquium, of course, we have two excellent presentations. First one will be delivered by Associate Professor Halim Rane. Let me introduce him very briefly, and without losing any time, we will start with his presentation. Associate Professor Halim Rane is a lecturer of Islamic studies, specializing in the sociology of religion, contemporary Islamic thought, and Muslim communities in the West School of Humanities, Languages, and Social Science at Griffith University in Brisbane. He is the director of Griffith Center for Social and Cultural Research and deputy head of school learning and teaching. Also, he is also the president, our president for Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. Welcome, Dr. Halim Rane. We would like to we are really looking forward to listening to you. Please, without losing any time, I think we should start with you. Please, welcome.
Thank you, Hakan. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for having me. I should say that I was Deputy Director of the School of Humanities back between 2013, 2015. I'm not in that role anymore, and I was only the Acting Director of the GCSCR, the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research, and I finished that in 2020, that role, mid-2020. So I'm not doing that, but I'm still the president of AIMS.
All right. Yes, I have that from your website, from your profile.
Yeah. Okay, so let me begin. So some of you might be aware that in 2019, me and my team at Griffith University, we did a national survey of Muslim Australians. We surveyed 1,034 Muslim Australians, and we supplemented that with focus groups in 7 cities around the country, and including we hosted one of our sessions there at ISRA in Melbourne. And there's a lot of data that came out of this research, but one of the topics we were interested in was this question of typology of Muslims. And let me try, how do I move from slide to slide? There we go. As you're probably aware, there's been a lot of research, over the past probably couple of decades, talking about typologies of Muslims. And so I'm going to talk about that today. So in my presentation, I'm going to, this is the main article that from which the data comes. It's the Islam in Australia survey. Ardis Judaria and I have written another article that we've submitted to Contemporary Islam. So we're still waiting for them to give us, feedback on whether or not they're going to publish that or not. But that's specifically about the typologies. But what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about that literature concerning typologies. Then I'll talk about the typologies overall that we looked at in our study, and then some of the findings we made in relation to the typologies concerning issues around gender, sources of influence, questions that concern Sharia and society, and also questions that concern jihad and violence. Look, I am, I'm well aware that there's been so much attention on this question of jihad and violence in relation to Muslims, and much of it gets to be quite problematic. But the reason why I'm talking about it here is because many of these typologies have been constructed around these kinds of themes. So I think it's important that we look at those themes in relation to these typologies. So let's just begin with the literature. First of all, I'd like to point out that there's been a lot of scholars in our field that have hypothesized about about the different typologies or the categories of Muslims. We could probably trace this back to Talal Asad back in a paper that he wrote in 1986, looking at the idea of an anthropology of Islam. But others have been done, like, for example, D'Assetto in 1996, which was written in French. Khaled Abou al-Fadl has also written on this. If you're familiar with his book, The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from the Extremists, he really establishes 2 major categories of Muslims, one that he calls the moderates and the others that he calls the Puritans. Under the moderates, he talks about, your traditional, kind of peaceful, average, everyday, practicing Muslims. And under the Puritans, he says, this encompasses those that otherwise get classified as fundamentalist, extremist, maybe ultra conservative, those kinds of categories. But actually, it was the work of Abdullah Saeed that we drew on the most to construct the categories that we tested in our survey. In Abdullah Saeed's 2007 paper on trends in contemporary Islam, he provided a list of about, I think it was 7 or 8 different categories. And we basically used the definitions he developed for those categories in our survey. And we supplemented it with a couple of others, because I think he didn't include one that related to Sufism. So we supplemented it with some work that I think Tariq Ramadan had done as well to construct the categories that we used. And I'll show you what those categories were. Bazenja is another one that's written about, discourses, identity and community, and this idea of categorization of Muslims in a paper he published in the Muslim World. Now, what's interesting about this literature is that usually it's just sort of theoretical. They construct the categories, but they don't really give you any insight into how many Muslims are in each of the categories. There are a couple of exceptions. Goli and Razai, they're 2 scholars from Denmark, in their study on radical Islamism and the migration of Muslims to Denmark, they talk about categories of Muslims, but more at that end of the spectrum that are, that are classified as fundamentalist, radical, those kinds. And they were actually focused a lot more on Muslim youth. And Achilov and Sen also did a study where they had constructed or used some typologies, and they had some data as well on percentages and things of Muslims falling into particular categories. But again, with theirs, they were focusing more on the political Islam end of the spectrum. What we were attempting to do is try to see the Muslim community more comprehensively, and that's why we leant towards Abdullah Saeed's categories, because we felt that that was covering the spectrum a lot more broadly. Okay, so now just looking at the typologies. One point to note is that while we have these particular labels, it's important to note that when we did the survey, we did not use these labels that you see in red here. And that's because we wanted to reduce the possibility of something called label avoidance. It's a psychological term where in survey and other sort of social science research, sometimes if you put particular labels there, people will steer away from them because they don't like to be labeled. So rather what we did was we took the definitions that were given in the literature by people like Abdullah Saeed and others to construct the categories without the label, and we added the label later for the purposes of our analysis. And so I'm sharing them here with you. So the categories that we looked at, how many were there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 categories. So the first one was the cultural nominalist. This is someone, and we provided the statement, I'm a cultural Muslim for whom Islam is based on my family background rather than my religious practice. So we gave that the label cultural nominalist, following on from Abdullah Saeed. And keeping in mind, when we asked these questions, every survey respondent was asked each of the questions or provided with each of the statements, and they were asked to say whether or not they strongly agreed, neither, disagreed, or strongly disagreed with each of them, so that we could, get a response for each of the categories that we provided. Second one was, for me, Islam is a matter of personal faith rather than public identity. We called that secular. Next one, I believe Islam aligns with human rights, civil liberties, and democracy. We called that liberal. I'm a committed Muslim who believes in the rational cosmopolitan nature of Islam based on the principles of social justice, gender justice, and religious pluralism. We called that progressive. I'm a committed Muslim. I'm a committed reform-minded Muslim who emphasizes the spirit and ethical principles of Islam over literal interpretations. We called that the ethical maqasidi. So drawing on from this concept of maqasid. Next one was, I'm a devout Muslim who follows a more spiritual path rather than formal legal rules. We called that Sufi. And I'll admit that I think that was probably, not the best definition that could be given. It's a bit difficult to come up with a single statement that could capture that. And I think more work could be done in that space. Next one was, I'm a devout Muslim who follows a traditional understanding of Islam. We called that the traditionalist. I'm a strict Muslim who follows Islam according to the laws of Sharia. We call that a legalist. I'm a committed Muslim who believes politics is part of Islam and advocates for an Islamic state based on Sharia law. We call that the political Islamist. And I'm a committed Muslim who believes an Islamic political order and Sharia should be implemented by force if necessary. We call that the militant. Okay, so now you know what the categories are, or the definitions. Now we can have a look at this next part, which shows you how the results came in relation to each of the typologies. As you can see, the one that was agreed with mostly, and what I'm showing you here is those people who said strongly agree or agree versus those who said disagree or strongly disagree. So when it came to the liberal category, which you'll remember is means that I believe Islam aligns with human rights, civil liberties, and democracy, 89% either agreed or strongly agreed, and only 4% disagreed with that. Progressive, which you'll recall was, I'm a committed Muslim who believes in the rational cosmopolitan nature of the Islamic tradition based on principles of social justice, gender justice, and religious pluralism. That came in at 75% with 6% disagreeing. Then we had the traditionalist. I follow a traditional understanding of Islam, 61% versus 16%. Ethical maqasidi. I follow Islam according to the, I'm a committed reform-minded Muslim who emphasizes the spirit and ethical principles of Islam over literal interpretations. That was the ethical maqasidi, 59% versus 16%. The secular was the one who said that, for me, Islam is a matter of personal faith rather than public identity. So, of course, we didn't mean someone who's not religious here. In fact, many of those people who picked secular, observe the, the salah, the daily prayers. But 54% picked that one, 28% disagreed. Sufi, 45% versus 22%. Legalist, 43% versus 27%. Political Islamist, 21% versus 52%. Cultural nominalist, this was the person who has a Muslim identity but doesn't actually observe the practice in Islam, 17%, and then 71% disagreed. So it was the second highest when it came to disagreement. But the most disagreed category was militant. 80% disagreed and only 8% agreed with that. And for your information, only 3% strongly agreed with that one. Okay, so moving forward, some of the things we noticed when we started analyzing the data is that these typologies are not mutually exclusive, but there's overlap between different combinations of these typologies. For example, a lot of the people that ended up in the liberal category were also progressive. Secular and liberal also went together. Liberal, ethical, maqasidi, and progressive went together. Liberal, progressive, and traditionalist also went together. Ethical, maqasidi, and progressive went together. Liberal and traditionalist went together. Cultural nominalist and secular went together. Sufi and ethical maqasidi went together. And there was also overlap with traditionalist and legalist, and traditionalist and political Islamist. And there was also overlap between legalist and political Islamist and political Islamist and militant. So for example, of the 34 respondents who strongly agreed with the militant typology, 27 of those, that's almost 80%, 79%, also strongly agreed with the political Islamist typology. Of the 98 respondents who strongly agreed with the political Islamist typology, 27% of those strongly agreed with the militant typology. So there were these kinds of combinations we saw. And I should also point out that there was 15% of our respondents who did not strongly agree with any of the categories. So I think there's more to be said about how Muslims categorize themselves. And there's perhaps other categories out there that we could discover beyond these ones that we drew from the literature. Now, then we started to look at these typologies in relation to some of the demographic data and some of the other responses to other questions in the survey. And what was interesting when it came to comparing with gender, we noticed that there was some significant differences between males and females. And what we found was that males were more likely to choose certain categories, including traditionalists, slightly more, but certainly significantly more legalist, political Islamist, cultural nominalist, and militant. So these were more dominated by males than females. We found an underrepresentation of females there and an overrepresentation of males in those categories. Then we looked at place of birth because we were curious, is there anything different to see when you compare the Muslims born in Australia and Muslims born overseas? Now, fortunately, our survey was quite representative when it came to these kinds of things. We had almost a 50-50 male-female split. We had a split between born in Australia, born overseas that mirrors the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, which, as you can see here, the ABS data from 2016 has 36%, and we had 38% born in Australia. Born overseas, 63%, we had 61%. So we're very close to the ABS data on a lot of these key indicators like age and age distribution, gender, born in Australia, born overseas, different distribution of ethnicities and so forth. Now, when we looked at the typologies here, we found that some of them were, you could see there was above average among the Australian born or below, and some you can see above average born overseas or below. So you can see here with cultural anomalies, for example, below average, if the average is 38 or 39% for born in Australia, below when it comes to cultural anomalies, only 25%, but above for those born overseas. So maybe it tells us something about a preference for people migrating to Australia who are perhaps more sort of non-practicing, but maybe still retaining a Muslim identity. Other ones that I've highlighted here include the progressive, slightly less likely to be Australian, but more likely to be born overseas. Ethical maqasidi as well, slightly less likely to be Australian, more likely to be from overseas than the average. Sufi as well goes that way. But then we also see when it comes to, for example, political Islamist, a lot less likely to be Australian than the average, and quite a bit more likely to be from overseas. But it evens out when you get to militant though. Militant is actually quite close to the average, both for born in Australia and for born overseas. So I think that's quite an interesting finding as well, that the numbers of Australian born pops back up there, whereas it's not as strong when it just comes to being a political Islamist. When you include that element of using force, the Australian born seem to reappear again there. Okay, feel free to ask questions if you want, but I think we've got a Q&A session at the end, isn't that right, Hakan?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so then we were also interested in influences, where we asked our respondents what they considered to be the most influential sources for their information about Islam. And we asked about many sources, but I've just included in this table here 4 particular sources: imams, sheikhs and ulama, mosque and madrasa classes, family and the internet. And this was the overall finding. So you can see imams, sheikhs and ulama were influential for about 30% of our respondents. About 20% for the mosque, about 28% for family, and about 17% for the internet. That was the average overall. And then you can see how that changes when you look at the specific typology. So you can see here that for the imams are quite influential on traditionalist, particularly so for legalist, political Islamist, and particularly so for militant. And I guess the imams can't help who finds them influential, but that was interesting that we found that there. For the mosque and madrasa classes, it was very similar. Again, traditionalist, legalist, political Islamist, and militant, also stating that the mosque or madrasa classes were very influential. They were also the most likely, as well as Sufi, to say family is very influential. And they were also more likely to see the internet as being more influential, more so than the other categories. So these were, I think, quite interesting findings about where the sources of influence come from, and which categories are more influenced by various sources. We also asked a series of questions that related to Sharia. One of the first questions we asked was whether or not you think of Sharia as being a divine revealed law, or do you think of it as being sort of the accumulation of juristic opinions over, Muslim jurists over a period of time. As you can see here, the progressive, the ethical Maqasidi, and the Sufi all were highly represented in thinking that the Sharia is really the culmination of interpretations and opinions of the jurists, of human beings, whereas the traditionalists, legalists, the political Islamists, and the militant all were a lot more, or overrepresented, you could say, in thinking about Sharia as a divine law. We also asked, how content are you with Islam in Australia, with your ability to practice Islam in Australia? And you could see a lot more discontent among those who we categorized as legalist, political Islamists, and militant, as opposed to the others. As you can see, overall, 73% were content, but you can see that that is lower here among, legalists, political Islamists, and militants. But really only slightly so. We asked whether or not Sharia, countries that implement Sharia laws are more just and fair than Australia. The cultural nominalists stood out here, we noticed, but also, the traditionalists, the legalists, the political Islamists, and militant. So it suggests to us that people who are in these categories have a particular understanding perhaps of Australia's legal system, or a particular view or opinion about it. And they also have a particular view or opinion, perhaps an imagined or maybe a bit of a romanticized understanding of how certain legal systems operate overseas, or there may be something specific that they have issue with in respect to Australian law, or something that they particularly like about judicial systems overseas. We also asked about human equality and gender equality, and this is just reflecting those who strongly agreed that all human beings should be treated equally and that men and women should have equal rights. So we're just looking at strongly agree here. As you can see, the overall average was 75% of respondents strongly agreed with human equality, and 62% strongly agreed with gender equality. And when then looking down through the typologies, you can see that, it's above average among liberals, among secular, among progressives, among ethical Maqasidi, among Sufis. It's about average among traditionalists, but it drops below the average among legalists, political Islamists, and especially militants, dropping far below. Similarly, with gender equality, we see that the average was 62%, strongly agreeing. Cultural nominalists are close to that. Liberals are more, secular more, progressives more, ethical Maqasidi more. Sufi started to soften a little bit. And then we see a drop below the average quite significantly among traditionalists, legalists, political Islamists, and militants. Particularly among militants, you can see a very, dramatic change, about half as much when you compare those two. Then we asked a number of questions about jihad. And of course, some of these typologies have been developed, particularly when you look at the work of Gholi and Razai and others. They were really framed within the context of, questions about jihad and extremism and violence and that sort of thing. So we thought it was necessary to compare our data with our findings and the questions we asked regarding these types of issues like jihad, for example. Now, the average overall, we asked, do you think that jihad is, spiritual, charitable, and other kinds of struggle, including defensive armed struggle? And then same definition, but defensive and offensive armed struggle. We found 68% said it's defensive only and 18% said it's offensive. But I want to make a note here. And when we asked our focus groups after we did the survey about this finding, a lot of people around the country said that they interpreted the word offensive to mean defending people overseas. So they really actually thought about it in a defensive mode, but they kind of maybe misinterpreted the word offensive. So I think this category would be less if people understood what this word offensive meant. So a point to note for all the researchers out there, we have to always be careful about the terminology we use and check to see that people understand these words in the way we intend them. So we found by doing the focus groups that this probably would have been a lot less if people, had a better understanding of what offensive means. They really confused the two a little bit. some people. Now, so looking at these two, we can see that there is an increase in those who view Islam, they drop below the average, those who say defensive only among traditionalists, legalists, political Islamists, and militants. That's probably not surprising. And those that think about it offensively, you see an increase in these categories as well. So clearly, many of them did mean offensive when they said offensive, and that's sort of showing up over here. Now, there's also don't know, unsure. And one of the things I would highlight for other researchers out there is that for a lot of the questions that we asked, there were significant numbers of people who didn't know or were unsure, about questions that related to politics, Sharia, jihad, those kinds of kind of complex or controversial concepts. A lot of people were not sure. So I think there's a lot of scope for more education, I think, within the Muslim communities about some of these issues and topics and concepts. We asked about whether or not the statement, attacking innocent civilians is never permitted in Islam. Or we didn't use the word innocent, we just said attacking civilians is never permitted in Islam. And basically 90% agreed with, or strongly agreed with that. And you can see that drops down a little bit with the cultural nominalists, perhaps because they have a bit of a critical view of Islam, or their understanding of it is perhaps maybe aligned with certain interpretations, perhaps. But we found this to be higher among liberals, secular, progressives, ethical maqasidi, Sufi as well, just on the average, I suppose, and also with traditionalists. But you can see that it drops when it comes to militants. So militants were not as likely to say attacking innocent civilians is never permitted, although 74% of them still said that it's never permitted in Islam. Then we made a statement about martyrs, and we said that someone who dies attacking innocent civilians is not a martyr. And what's reflected here is the people who strongly agreed. 84% strongly agreed with that. As you can see, a little bit below average with the cultural nominalists, but above average with the liberals, secular, progressives, ethical maqasidi, Sufis as well. A little bit below the average with the traditionalists, probably not statistically significant though. I'll have to double check on that one. But you can see that you start to see a significant difference when you get into the territory of the legalist, the political Islamist, and the militant. Their views on this particular point are quite different to everybody else. Now, I'm almost finished. Thank you very much for listening. I've just got a couple more slides. One of the other questions we asked was, how open are you to new knowledge about Islam? And overall, this is the 1,034 people who took the survey overall, 88% of the survey respondents said that they were completely or very open to new knowledge about Islam. Another 10% said that they were somewhat open to new knowledge about Islam, and less than 2% said that they were not very or not at all open to new knowledge about Islam. So for those of us who are educators, I think that this should alert us to the prospect that there's a lot of interest in learning more about Islam and a lot of openness to new information that those of us who work in the field of Islamic and Muslim studies, there's probably going to be a lot of interest in the research that we do, potentially. Now, in relation to the typologies, openness was found to be stronger than average among Sufis, legalists, quite surprisingly perhaps, because they were always at the other end of the spectrum on other questions, ethical maqasidi, and political Islamists as well. Now, I think that's very important because political Islamists are often seen as being within a pool of people who are maybe susceptible to extreme or radical ideas. But, the fact that they're so open to new knowledge about Islam suggests that, information like Hakan and I were talking about the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, and, the implications they have for peaceful interfaith relations. Maybe that knowledge or information about that might be something that could be very helpful to people in this category who are sometimes seen as being vulnerable to ideas that are extreme or radical. Traditionalists and progressives were also above the average, as were liberals and seculars. But cultural nominalists slightly dropped under, and militants slightly dropped under as well, but not significantly, not statistically significantly. And so the fact that 85% of people who are categorized as militant are also open to new knowledge about Islam, I think is very encouraging for being able to educate or use education or engage with information in terms of addressing some of this ideas related to extremism. So just to conclude, from our research, the typologies are not mutually exclusive, but they overlap. The categories that have been constructed by scholars such as Abdullah Saeed and others were quite valid categories. We found that most of our survey participants fitted into one or a number of those categories, although there was 15% that didn't select any of the 10 that we proposed. A spectrum of typologies exists, with a majority of Muslims aligning with more liberal, progressive and ethical understandings of Islam rather than the more legalist and political interpretations or categories. A significant minority of our survey respondents align with the legalist and political Islamist ideas, about 20% of our survey respondents. But when we looked at those people, it was more men than women. These were people who tended to be more influenced by imams, the mosque, their own families, and the internet, more so than people in the other categories. These were also people who were more likely to see Sharia as divine, and they were less content with their ability to practice Islam in Australia. And they had less agreement when compared to the majority or the rest of the survey respondents. There was less agreement around human and gender equality. Although it was still a majority among them, they were just sort of less inclined there. Although the militant didn't reach a majority when it came to gender equality. Most don't advocate violence. I think that's a very important point to note. Irrespective of being categorized as political Islamist or even militant, overwhelmingly our survey respondents said it's not, Islamic to engage in violence against civilians. That came across very clearly, and I think very encouragingly, as I've noted already, the overwhelming majority are open to new knowledge about Islam, which I think is very encouraging for those of us who are educators or who are engaged with these questions about countering violent extremism and de-radicalization and that sort of thing, or just want Muslims to have a more informed understanding of the religion that aligns with what we might consider to be its true teachings, rather than interpretations that have been developed in more modern times because of political contexts and their own experiences of violence, because as we know, violence begets violence, and that might be part of the challenge here. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Halim Rane, for this excellent presentation. I think the very good findings and very interesting. These typologies, as we can see, we have different expressions, maybe understandings of Islam, different approaches, and of course, this affects their understanding of Islam and maybe approach to many topics and issues. All right, if you have any question to Halim, Dr. Halim, please, you can pose. You can either speak, right, or maybe you can write. You can type on chat box, please. We have just around 10 minutes Q&A and A session, please.
I have a question, Hakan.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Halim. That was a fantastic presentation, and congratulations on completing that long, pretty massive research. It was excellent. My question, naturally, I'm interested in that, the ones that want to learn, more about Islam.
Yeah, of course.
Were you able? Did you ask any further questions, or was it just that question?
About learning more information? No, we just said, how open are you to new knowledge? We asked the question about how confident are you with the knowledge that you have, and most people said that they were quite confident. But in spite of saying that they're quite confident, they also said that they're open to new knowledge, regardless of which typology they ended up in. The openness was quite comprehensive across our survey respondents.
Okay, yeah. We might do some further study on that, but I guess yours we were actually thinking of that, Zuleyha and I.
Yeah, maybe we could work together and collaborate and maybe do a new version of this survey together with questions and explore, maybe drop a few because it was a pretty long survey, and maybe then go into detail on a few of the things that we did find.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, that would be nice.
All right, let's have a talk offline about that then.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right. Good.
All right. Dr. Salih Yusel is asking that how far those who participated in the survey were aware of these terminologies when they did this research, when they did the survey. Did you explain the terminology briefly to them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't provide the labels because we wanted to prevent something called label avoidance, which is where people will be disinclined to choose a category because they're concerned about being labeled. So all we did was provide them with the statement that came out of the academic literature mainly. But the point here is that some of the terminology is a little bit sophisticated, and what we found in the focus groups was overall people were they had a good level of understanding of the terminology that was used, but I think that we could probably simplify that terminology a bit more. I think that would be better if we could do that. Having more precise terminology does allow you to be more precise when you're doing your analysis, but I think that maybe you lose a little bit in terms of whether or not people understood the question and a word in the way the researcher intended. So you live and learn.
All right, thank you, Halim. Any other question?
I had a question.
Yes.
So thanks, Hakim. Thank you again, Associate Professor Halim. That was a really good presentation. I just wanted to get more information about the category of Sheikh, Ulama, Imams. Were their local Sheikh or Imam, or was that someone that they all tuned into within Australia? And similarly with the internet category, was that also a personality that they went and got information from, or was it their writings or a video? Or are you able to break that down a bit further?
Thanks, Ahmed. If you did the survey, it was already pretty long. So we didn't specify whether we were referring to local or overseas imams, sheikhs, ulama. That's a good point that you make. And we didn't ask them in that question specifically to say what website or whatever internet sort of thing that they're doing. However, we did ask some open-ended questions where we asked them about influential individuals, influential groups, and influential sources such as online and books and other sources. And from that free text, we've got some more data there that we can analyze to look at who respondents considered to be most influential. And so it's just a matter of analyzing that data. We have made some progress with it, but lots of things happening, and you don't always we haven't finished doing that actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, Leila, please.
Jazakallah khairan, Brother Halim. That was really informative, and I have used that in my proposal, and it just got confirmed last Friday. I'm so happy.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Just with your participants, just remind me, jog my memory, because I was part of the focus groups. What was the education level generally?
Yeah.
The 1,000. Yeah.
Thanks for raising that. While our participants were quite well aligned with the census data in terms of gender, ethnicity, employment, unemployment, and like born in Australia, born overseas, and a few of those other key indicators, age distribution as well. Although with age, I should note that we were basically looking for people 18 and over, and if you were under 18, you had to have parents' permission to do it. So we probably lost a few young people because of that. But where we were overrepresented was with education. Now, if you look at the literature on surveys, you'll find that it tends to be more or better educated people that will take a survey. And our survey was long, and I suppose to some extent the questions were complex. And so that, I think, lent itself to attracting more higher educated people than less educated people. So we had about 60% of people that had some post-secondary school qualification, which is quite a bit higher than the national average in Australia. I think the national average for Muslims is about 50-something% for post-secondary school qualification. Don't quote me, I'm trying to remember something that Riaz Hassan wrote in a paper a few years ago now, but I think it was something along those lines. Mehmet maybe has looked at this statistics more recently, but we consider that we were overrepresented with education. But you know, it's, you're doing a survey, like, you know, like, yeah, that's the tricky part. But I think what's interesting, it does tell us that the other thing our survey showed was quite progressive views. It showed a maturity of thinking about Islam. It wasn't this kind of, you know, very base level, you know, uncritical kind of you know, blind following that the media or other sources might suggest is the way Muslims think about Islam. It showed us that our Muslim community are very thoughtful about the religion, how it relates to society, how Muslims relate to each other, etc., and how they relate to, you know, fellow Australians. It suggested to us a maturity of thought. It suggested to us some level of critical thinking about certain topics, and maybe that is telling us that if you educate people, you will get a positive kind of, you know, outcome like this. I'd be interested to know, if we were to do the survey with people who with much lower levels of education, what the differences would be. And we have done a little bit of research comparing those with without a post-secondary school education versus those with a post-secondary school education. And there were some differences on some indicators, like, for example, they were a little bit more vulnerable to being in the militant or political Islamist category. They were a little bit more likely to see things in black and white, maybe more likely to see Sharia as a divine law rather than as being the interpretation that's, you know, accumulated over time, and, you know, these kinds of things. So there were a few factors. In fact, we've got a paper that we've written that is under review at the moment that includes a bit of that information.
And that's for the younger ones, yeah?
That's for overall, not just for younger ones. Yeah, that was for overall.
Black and white, you were saying. The ones that you like the military.
I guess, I suppose that, you know, those of us in Islamic studies and whatnot are probably aware that there was probably differences of opinion or, you know, different readings or interpretations on topics. We don't necessarily see things as just this or just that. We're aware that there's, you know, 5 other opinions on this thing. And the more educated people were, the more they seemed to be aware of such things, something along those lines. But they also seem to have more progressive kind of views in that, you know, more pro-human rights, more pro-gender equality, a little bit of that sort of thing coming in as well. Yeah.
Right. So there's correlation between, like, say, social cohesion, I guess, in the end, with better educated Muslims, which is probably
yeah, it seemed like that. It seemed like that. Yeah.
Jazakallah khairan. It's very important.
Thanks, Layla.
Daria, maybe your final comment or questions, then
just before you go, Hakan,
yes.
I guess on that last point, when you say more educated, Halim, you don't mean in Islam, right? You mean...
No, we weren't really able to test how educated somebody was about Islam. We didn't ask if they had actually, we did ask whether or not they had an interest in Islamic studies at high school, and we did ask if they have a post-secondary school qualification in Islamic studies. So we were able to look at that. And actually, those people that did also exhibited quite progressive views, interestingly enough. But what I'm talking about in education generally is, you know, education generally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Daria, Dr. Daria, very briefly, please, because of limited time, please, very quickly.
Thank you, Halim. My quick question is, was there anything coming out significant in relation to gender dynamics?
Yeah, there was quite a bit that came out in terms of gender dynamics. I mean, one of the things, as I showed in the presentation, was with the typologies themselves. Women were less likely to be in the categories of militant and, you know, political Islamist and legalist and even traditionalist. Men were more likely than women to be in these categories. So, and women were more likely than men to be in some categories like I think progressive or ethical maqasidi, something like that. There were also some questions that related to gender equality and human equality, and women were slightly more likely to than men to be in those, particularly the ones that related to women, actually. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Halim Rane. This is a really excellent presentation, and I think very good findings for Australia. You know, in Australian context, Muslims and typologies of Muslims. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Hakan.
And now the first session is completed. Now Nasreen Hanifi, our second presenter, is Nasreen Hanifi. Let me briefly introduce her. Nasreen is a psychologist by profession and has been working in the field for the last 15 years. She has extensive experience in psychology and currently director of clinical services at My Ability Care. She specializes in trauma treatment, drug and alcohol and intellectual disability. She is an active community member and is currently serving as the president of Mission of Hope and director of clinical operations at Hayat House. She has a master's in Islamic studies from SAZAC, from our center at Charles University. Now, currently, she is doing her PhD on compassion from a psycho-spiritual perspective. It looks very interesting topic, and her title is How Do Muslims Show Compassion During the Challenging Times? A psycho-spiritual analysis of compassion. Nasreen, please, if you share your presentation, and we will continue with you. And by the way, two international reviewers are present as well, Dr. Abdullah Rothman and Dr. Nasreen, so Dr. Mohammed Nasir. Thanks for joining. Inshallah, after the presentation, we would like to hear your feedback and comments, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can everyone see my screen fully or?
Yes, please, could you make it full screen, please? Presentation version.
Is that better?
Yes, definitely. Yes, please.
No, lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, Dr. Hakan. I really appreciate it. So my topic of, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So my topic of presentation is how do Muslims show compassion during challenging times from a psycho-spiritual analysis of compassion. But before I begin, I want to extend my sincere thanks to the panel members for taking the time to attend this presentation, particularly Dr. Abdullah Rothman and Dr. Mohammed, who obviously are in different time zones at the moment. So I really appreciate you attending this. And to both of my supervisors who are here today as well, thank you so much for making sure I get through this. And to everyone else that's here, thank you. So in terms of the presentation, I'll provide a little bit of an introduction, a brief literature review, the statement of the problem, the objectives of the study, the significance of the study, scope of the research and the research questions, and both the research methodology and theoretical framework. I'll also briefly explain the tentative chapters that I'll be going through. I guess to start off with, I want to address the purpose of why I'm doing this study. So the aim of it is to see how Muslims display compassion when they are faced with challenging situations. And the purpose is to provide a more psycho-spiritual analysis of compassion, given that there is a lack of research in this particular field. I mean, we all know that compassion is a powerful and instinctual emotion and is frequently addressed in religious and psychological research. So given that there is a huge commonality between, of compassion that exists in many diverse religions and worldviews, I actually wanted to shed light on this from a more Islamic perspective. There is a lot of research area in this particular topic, particularly in relation to its definition. Oftentimes it can get very mixed up with the definition of empathy and altruism, but according to Goetz and colleagues, compassion can be defined as the emotional response when perceiving suffering and involves an authentic desire to help those that are suffering. Compassion in the literature is also considered as an affective state and people's ability to find motivation innovation to help those that are in need. There is really ample research on compassion from all fields, from an evolutionary perspective to neuropsych perspective to neuroscience to religious perspective, covering it all. So for the purpose of this presentation, to keeping the time frame in mind, I'll just mention a few research that's been conducted. So there's been a research conducted by Neff and Turch that suggests that the species preservative system, which is activated by various parts of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex, promotes awareness of the need for interconnectedness, as illustrated, for example, by an infant's heightened need for nurture. And what it's trying to say is that from an evolutionary stance, it informs us about the relational networks which bonds one person or one thing to another and helps us in understanding compassion more generally. So these, in my opinion, these evolutionary findings will be explored a lot further and will be helpful in the study, as it will provide an alternative perspective on compassion from that perspective. It will also help sort of me understand the significance of compassion as a trait and how its evolution has contributed significantly to the formation of bonds and profound social connection between human beings and other mammals. There is also ample research from a neuroscientific perspective and neuropsychology, obviously, which indicates that even though compassion is considered a fundamental aspect of society, people can, however, become desensitized to the suffering of others for a myriad of reasons. According to research conducted by Desity and Jackson, the reason why people become desensitized to a person's suffering, it could be as a result of specific traumas and or experiences that people may have had during their lifetime, hence preventing them from showing some kind of compassion towards other people. So to me, this shows that the neural pathways in our brains by which compassion is processed seems to rely on a very shared network comprising parts of the pain matrix, which some of us may experience, making it difficult for people to show compassion, and hence why, in my opinion, it is important to provide further research on why or how Islamic spirituality can have, the impact Islamic spirituality can have on the brain and its functionality. Further to this, the largest religious movements in the world, such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, place considerable emphasis on compassion, on people having compassion, compassionate attitudes and behaviors. I know research by Stefan et al. Suggests that all religions have compassion, believe in compassion from similar perspectives. And I guess, for example, Christianity teaches people to love others as themselves and give to others in need. Similarly, in Islam, one of the 5 pillars is zakat, so sharing of wealth with the needy, which is pretty much designed to help the needy and the poor, as well as the spiritual well-being of the giver. Hindu concepts of karma and dharma also emphasize unselfish actions, as well as these concepts of profoundly, quite evident in Buddhism as well. So just continuing on to the literature review, I have used a lot of Islamic theologians and in this particular literature review, because I think it will help enhance the research as well. For example, Imam Ghazali, in his book, The Alchemy of Happiness, provides a thorough analysis of compassion from a spiritual point of view. He states that God has created prophets, sending them to mankind and leading them to their law, and to love them is a perfume of his universal beneficence. Similarly, Said Nursi also provides a lot of information on, discusses the role of compassion at length in his work. He discusses God's attributes and ascertains that his compassion surpasses over everything. He also discusses that compassion is a man's most gentle and agreeable characteristic. However, these shine when a man has a strong relationship with God and does not assign any partners to him. Contemporary researchers, like Dr. Abdullah Rothman and Dr. Nasser Muhammad, also discuss the importance of compassion from an Islamic psychology perspective at length, which I will be using extensively in this research, given that majority of it will have a strong focus on that as well. even Jeffrey et al. Also reports that compassion has emerged from our mammalian caregiving neurophysiology and is evident in facilitating connection, care, and improved social functioning. However, although there is so much significant research on compassion from various fields, however, there is some limitations to the literature. So the available literature on compassion from an evolutionary perspective, for example, only examines how the differences between animals and humans and how they process compassion and empathy. But the literature does not focus on recognizing that compassion from an evolutionary perspective is a much more recent concept and may require, for example, the emergence of higher order executive functioning, processing not available to non-primate animals. Another limitation in the literature is the use of fMRI studies. fMRI and can only look at blood flow in the brain and is unable to provide accurate information on the activities of individual nerve cells, which are critical to mental functioning. Another limitation I found is that it lacks to provide an in-depth analysis of compassion from a psycho-spiritual perspective, given that majority of the world's religion have a strong focus on compassion. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll go to the statement of the problem. There is limited research, even though there is a plethora of evidence in neuroscience and psychology on compassion. However, there seems to be limited research on compassion from an Islamic psycho-spiritual perspective, which limits our ability to understand the pivotal role that spirituality plays in shaping how people display compassion towards human suffering. And I guess by limiting studies to only focus on the scientific evidence builds a very narrow and simplistic view of compassion, particularly when some of the world's major religions fundamentally focus on compassion as part of their value and belief systems. So I guess the aim is to sort of identify how Muslims display compassion during challenging times from an Islamic psycho-spiritual perspective. And the reason why I want to focus on the neuropsychological research is to understand what stimulates compassion, particularly in terms of the brain and its functionality that will provide or enhance the research itself. The objectives, what I'd like to achieve is explore the current psycho-spiritual aspects of compassion and understand the concept of challenging times and how Muslims display compassion during those times. For me, the significance of the study, it will help, I will examine the different components of compassion by analyzing available literature and provide a comparative analysis between psychological concept of compassion and Islamic concepts of compassion. Since this study is has a comparative approach on compassion, it will help people understand how science and religion can be used to explain compassion. My main research question is, how do Muslims show compassion during challenging times, a psycho-spiritual perspective? But at the same time, I also want to answer the following sub-questions. So what stimulates compassion, and within that role, the role of Islamic spirituality? What is the role of Islamic spirituality amongst Muslims in showing compassion during challenging times? A neuropsychological and spiritual analysis of compassion. In terms of the scope, I actually only want to focus on two main areas, so neuropsychology and Islamic spirituality. I think it will allow me to critically analyze existing and current literature on compassion from just those two main areas, and it will sort of allow me to consider how Muslims show compassion towards the suffering of others. At the same time, I also want to add, explore some other questions like what stimulates compassion, what kind of spiritual motivation and practice play a role in displaying active compassion amongst Muslims, and what does an individual gain from showing compassion? Let's just to sort of give you a bit of a rundown. The theoretical framework, I really want to focus on cognitive behavior therapy. So, you know, cognitive behavior therapy is sort of a component that's been derived from psychotherapy, and it helps understand a person's thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. And there's numerous studies conducted on the importance of CBT and spirituality. And they have identified that the core beliefs that people develop during those early stages of development mostly involve some kind of spiritual connection. I think there is also evidence that the use of CBT with people who are of different faith backgrounds, for example, most faiths share with CBT the practice of reflection, the search for meaning, and the journey of the self and societal improvement. I know Dr. Rothman and his colleagues also did a research on this, and they argue that CBT is considered as one of the most widely used models for adapting religious orientations, and may be useful in the implementation of specific concepts in conjunction with Islamic sources to inform therapeutic approaches to treatment. So given that there is a huge similarity between, I wanted to be able to that kind of a framework in this particular study. And I guess the reason why I want to analyze the neuropsychology side of things is because there is already an abundance of research from that aspect on the functionality of the brain, particularly in relation to emotion regulation, which will help me understand what areas of the brain are activated or working when people display compassion in comparison to when they don't. The research design, I really am interested in a more qualitative research. Research which is concerned with quality and texture of human experience, and with the ways in which people construct and communicate meaning in social contexts. And I guess qualitative approaches enable, for example, will enable me to use open-ended questions, which will enable participants to use their own words rather than choosing from fixed responses that may not accurately represent their views. I'm also very interested in using grounded theory, which will help provide explanation or theory behind people's perceptions and thoughts around compassion. And I guess because I do have a larger sample size, grounded theory is always helpful within those contexts. But at the same time, I think it will help me identify the core of people's experiences and to produce patterns and identify relationships of meaning that could build new knowledge. My participants and sampling. So I've decided to choose 30 participants who identify as Australian Muslims living in Sydney between the ages of 18 and 65. I'll use purposive sampling. So participants are pretty much selected based because they meet a certain criteria. This will all give me the opportunity to ensure that a wide range of perspectives and backgrounds is explored. Participants are chosen based on the compassion rating scale scores, which is, I'll be using Kristen Neff's compassion rating scale. Whilst that particular rating scale is only for people who show compassion, who have self-compassion, but there is research that suggests that it can be used for towards compassion towards other people. I want to use semi-structured interviews because I think it will carry on conversations that would elicit rich data. And not only that, I think semi-structured interviews give participants more room to answer in terms of what's important to them and to control the introduction and flow of topics. I guess the questions will be framed in a manner that will provide participants with flexibility and freedom to explore how compassionate they feel or how compassionate they think they are. And I guess, open-ended questions for me will be used throughout the entire interview to encourage participants to talk freely and respond openly to queries. And some of the questions I really would like to sort of explore is, what are the motivations and actions behind showing compassion? What makes people compassionate? What activates their compassion, the role of religion when displaying compassion, and how do they feel when they display compassion? And do they notice any physiological changes to their bodies once they have displayed that particular compassion? So the last bit, I'm just on time, to my chapters. So I've decided to break it down into an introduction chapter. So introduction chapter will sort of cover everything that I've sort of run through at the moment. So from the intro to the literature review, the statement of the problem, research methodology, and so forth. Chapter 1, I want to look at compassion from a spiritual and neuropsychological point of view. Chapter 2, the stimulators of compassion. So what makes people compassionate, and especially act compassionately in tough times. Chapter 3, Muslim participants' display of compassion. So what kind of compassion do they display, in which ways, and in what cases they display it. Chapter 4, the gain from showing compassion. So A, the spiritual and neuropsychological gain, and then B, outcome of compassionate behavior. And chapter 5, I will look into the conclusion and implications and any potential contribution of the research outcomes to the current already training packages on compassion that's available. That's about it. Thank you so much. It was very brief and short, but I hope I did make my point across, get my point across.
All right, Nasreen, thank you so much. I think this is a very good summary of your research, and on time, just 20 minutes, 20 minutes, you have completed. Great, I think. All right, let me first ask Dr. Abdullah Rothman. He's Executive Director for International Association of Islamic Psychology. I think he's also affiliated with Cambridge Muslim College, as far as I know. And Dr. Abdullah, I know the time is way too early, I think, in the UK. Thank you so much for joining to this colloquium. It is a pleasure to host you in this research colloquium. If you can provide your general feedback for Nasreen, then after the colloquium, as I said in my email, we will have more detailed panel discussions. Yes, please.
All right, thank you. Nice to be with you all in Sydney while I'm over here in the UK. Yeah, like you said, it's early, but this is when I do my best work anyway, in the early morning hours. So thank you, Nasreen, for your presentation. It was I think it was a really good summary of what I read in your proposal. I think you covered all the points and did a good job presenting it. So Mabruk to that. I would say overall, I think this is a really important topic, especially because compassion is such a sort of hot topic and word, but it gets a lot of attention with Buddhism, and not very many people understand it as something directly connected to Islam. And so I think it's an important thing to understand, and to understand how it functions for people's understanding and motivation towards change in, like you said, in difficult times. So I think it's a worthwhile project. Some questions I have are I was a little unclear of why neuropsychology and CBT, and because within a qualitative approach, so grounded theory, and you state that your main focus is on understanding compassion in relation to Islamic spirituality. So I understand that a lot of the research focuses on, there's a lot of research there to pull on that focuses on neuropsychology, but I'm just wondering how that will come into play in your actual study in interviewing your participants. Where will the neuropsychology and CBT come into play, other than just sort of reporting on it in the literature review?
I guess the intention for the neuropsychology aspect was to provide a, from my understanding, is just to provide it more in the literature review, just report the findings and all of that. So that's the intention. But using CBT as a framework, which will help sort of create questions, particularly when I'm doing semi-structured interviews, but at the same time when I'm assessing the semi-structured interviews as well, I can use that, the concepts that exist in CBT to fulfill that. So that's that's where I've sort of seen the connections. I mean, it makes sense to me, but obviously, as you know, other people, it may not. But if there's sort of a better way to do that, I'm open to obviously suggestions.
Yeah, to me, it was a little confusing because for my perspective, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a mode of therapy. So it's usually used in clinical practice, and it would be hard to understand how that would be used in analyzing data. Whereas maybe some of the concepts of perhaps compassion and spirituality within therapy, I mean, I think those are used in conjunction with CBT, but they're not necessarily integral parts of CBT as an approach in therapy. And so you make some connections in the paper between CBT and Islamic spirituality, and I think there may be a little confusion there because I think CBT is often used. It can be used in conjunction with spirituality because there's room for it. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily an integral part. So like when there's a comparison between CBT and Islamic spirituality, that's unclear.
Okay.
And then I think also it would be good to define what you mean by Islamic spirituality, because I think that's a pretty vague notion that can be experienced by different people in different ways and defined differently. So I think defining it will be really important. And then also, I think in your sample, I would recommend, so I know you're looking at a scale for compassion, but I'm wondering why not a scale or at least an inclusion criteria that is about people's orientation to spirituality? Because if you're looking at how does Islamic spirituality play into the people's experience of compassion, you may get, if you're looking at a population of just Muslims and the inclusion criteria is that they identify as Muslim, you may get 30 people that have no relationship to spirituality or Islamic spirituality. So you're going to have to do some way of assessing people's orientation to, so you know, there are scales for religiosity, but then again, I'm not sure if that's going to equate with what you're looking for in terms of spirituality. So you may need to figure out a way to have some sort of way of identifying inclusion criteria around spirituality. And I would say, to me, that would probably be more important than the compassion scale, because I think compassion is going to come out anyway, because it's a human experience, whether they rate here on compassion or there on compassion. I'm not sure if how that's going to help what your focus is.
Thank you for that. I actually like that point. I didn't really think of it in that context, but I'll definitely consider it for including into the paper. Definitely. Okay. Thank you.
And then I guess I don't know how much time we have. I'll leave time for other people, but just about grounded theory. So why did you choose grounded theory? Are you intending to generate theory? Like, is there a theory that's missing that it needs to be filled, this gap? Because otherwise, this is what grounded theory is for generating theory. Otherwise, most of, I think, what you're talking about in the paper sounds more like thematic analysis or, you know, comparative analysis.
Yeah, I was tossing between the two, in all honesty, whether I should do like a grounded theory approach or a thematic analysis. So yeah, so I was tossing between the two, and I guess the reason why I went with grounded theory was because I thought it might help me generate patterns and new information. But then again, you know, a thematic analysis can probably do the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe can I just jump in here? I think the logic behind it initially was because spirituality wasn't discussed too much in this field. It was very secular. There are compassion training packages, but they just keep of religion out of these packages. So although there seems to be Buddhism impact, they don't recognize and acknowledge it. And the Islamic spiritual component in this context is very new. We didn't really want to limit ourselves with certain theories because we don't know what will come out. So identifying compassionate people, and we were initially thinking of also self-identified religious people, but we need to reconsider maybe their closeness to spirituality. They're close, they're spiritual and they show compassion, but what are the, stimulators and factors turning this compassion into action in what circumstances? So this is an unresearched area. That's why we thought maybe grounded theory will help us understand. They will give us the answer because we don't want to really approach them with a particular theory. That was the initial, I think, talk with Nasreen while we were discussing why grounded theory.
Okay. So maybe just maybe what would help is defining why a little bit more of why the grounded theory is needed. So what is it that's missing that requires the generation of new theory? Like that could be hashed out a little bit more.
All right, Dr. Abdullah, thank you so much for these very important feedback. We will continue, discussions will continue after 10 minutes during our private panel, all right, to make a final decision after the colloquium. I would like to pose a question, I would like to ask the audience and Dr. Mehmet, Dr. Halim, we have great scholars, academics here. If you have any comments, any recommendations, or any question to Nasreen and others as well, please, that will be very helpful for Nasreen as well.
I was also going to ask kind of about grounded theory, that even though some theories may not be applicable fully, they can still be explored and applied to some extent, with conclusions being, you can still come to some important conclusions, without necessarily a theory, as long as there's some conceptual framework and a really good methodology. I was just going to highlight that. I was going to ask the same question.
All right, thank you, Mehmet, Dr. Mehmet, for this feedback. Any other comments, feedback, or questions to Nasreen?
Yeah, can I just ask?
Yes, Zuleha, please.
Nasreen, lovely presentation, great topic. I think you did touch on it, but I think a key part of this is a measure for a person's spirituality. So did you say you had a theory that you would be focusing on? Because it seems like you're really going to look at the comparison or correlation between how spiritual someone is and how compassionate they are. That's the impression I'm getting. So have you got a measure?
In terms of my framework?
Yeah.
So in my framework, I will be using cognitive behavior therapy, which, in my opinion, goes really well with Islamic spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, looking forward to it. It sounds very exciting.
All right, we have another reviewer, Dr. Muhammad Nasir, but he's in Malaysia based. I think maybe he's praying Friday prayer, Jumu'ah, Salat al-Jumu'ah because of the time, but he will join, I think, within 10 minutes, around 10 minutes. For this reason, I didn't ask him, but he's gonna come back very soon. Any other questions or feedback?
Again, about
yes.
the spirituality thing, because the issue with these religiosity scales, they're really very much based on Christianity and non-Muslim traditions, because the religiosity is always in relation to the frequency of going to church, for example, attending congregations on Sundays. So again, because the Islamic spirituality scales are adopted using these measures, there are always shortfalls, especially if they're asked to women, because for women, there's no need to go mosque. even for Fridays or in general or daily prayers. That's why maybe using these religious skills can be unhealthy. Instead, we can using again, if people are self-identified as religious, then we can take their level of spirituality by asking a few questions about how do they see them spiritual, why do they see them spiritual, and understanding that spiritual concept from within instead of transferring religious skills which are always faulty.
I guess what could be done, Daria, is that those theories could be examined and then critically, analyzed, where Nasreen can propose, she can modify them with the Islamic framework, and she can propose a conceptual approach or theoretical approach for research from the outset. That saves a lot of time, trying to develop a theory and then apply that theory. I guess if you do grounded theory, then the focus is the theory itself. Whereas the understanding I got from Nasreen that she wants to focus on the practical elements of, I guess, isn't it, Nasreen? Yeah. You want to see the impact on people of these things. So I think you just need to address that theory problem by perhaps defining your theoretical or conceptual approach, let's say.
What do you mean by that?
It needs to be solid, obviously, but sorry?
Can you open a little bit more when you say it conceptually identify and unpack?
I guess you mentioned that there are theories out there that's developed for Christians and Christianity. Like Nasreen can look at those and then I guess critically evaluate and then propose a theory based on those, but modified to fit with the Islamic practices and the framework, and propose her own theory at the start. Like, I think that would be really useful. So in a way, you do a hybrid, rather than using them exactly or not having anywhere to start with. You develop a hybrid model.
There is a spirituality index, which isn't that ritualistic. It actually has quite a Buddhist feel. So, but like Mehmet said, that could be a starting point, and then really adapting it to an Islamic framework. Because I feel like you need to measure or somehow have a bit of a grade of people's how you see their spirituality based on their responses as part of this research, it seems. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, Züleyha, thank you. Any other comments, feedback, or questions? Dr. Mohammed Nasir, did you come back? Are you there? Are you here? I think not yet. Maybe he's gonna join to the private panel. Yeah, all right. If you don't have any further comments, questions, or feedback, I think now we should finish today's colloquium. Thank you so much for joining today. And this is the end of the first research colloquium, and we will continue research colloquium sessions. And inshallah, in May, we will have another one, and of course, 2 or 3 great presentations and topics. Thank you. And reviewers, Dr. Abdullah Rothman and Dr. Mohammed Nasir, and supervisors of Nasreen, please stay back. I will continue with you as private panel to finalize the review process for Nasreen's research proposal according to Charles University's Faculty of Arts and Education's policy. Thank you so much for others. Nasreen, you need to leave as well. You need to sorry? Yeah, you need to disconnect from the just reviews and supervisors. You're welcome. Just reviews and supervisors should stay back. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you for joining. Thank you, Halim, Dr. Halim, for joining, and others. and lovely presentations and topics, and I hope to see you in another research colloquium. All right.